The dark is a dread and desolate realm. Daylight banished, thoughts will run until fear conquers unlit corners. Laurelled by infants and adults alike, darkness is sovereign of creeping disquietude. The voice that tempts us to believe that something sinister may be present is, in fact, most certainly there. But why? What is it about this obscuration? Why do we fear the dark? My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. When night falls, we lock ourselves inside our homes, turning on the lights and banishing the dark. From campfires to candles to lamps and light bulbs, this is the way it has always been. For many, it is simply a matter of routine, rooted in practical necessity. Until it is time for bed, we need light in order to see what we are doing. There is no use in darkness. And yet, for a surprising percentage of the population, avoidance of the dark is something else. It is driven by fear. Despite pitch-black rooms being the archetypal torment of children, fear of the dark actually stays with many of us into adulthood. A more widespread source of anxiety than fear of heights, experts around the world regard it as a very common human experience, with one clinical psychologist estimating that around 11% of the US population is afraid of the dark. According to a 2012 UK survey of 2,000 adults, it may be more common still, with nearly 40% of respondents reporting that they were afraid to walk around their house with the lights off. Incredibly, 1 in 10 declared that they would not even leave their bed in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. Traditional explanations for why we fear the dark point to evolution. Adaptive behavior informed by our ancestral memories. Many psychologists believe that avoidance of darkness stems from self-preservation. Our ancient predecessors feared the clawed carnivore which came out at night, and so sticking to the light was a way to guard against predation. In the modern day, that same fear, the adrenal response, the strong desire to remove oneself from the frightening scenario, can also be said to make sense. Most of us would much rather walk down a lit alleyway at night rather than risk the potentially limitless danger of an unlit one. In short, fear has become hard-coded into our DNA. Through ancestral experience, our brains have come to associate the night with roaming predators of both the human and the animal kind, which triggers a flight response when we find ourselves enveloped in darkness. And so, a neat explanation. Yet, when one picks at the edges of the evolutionary answer to why we fear the dark, it can be said that its fibers begin to unravel. The most obvious opposition can be found through examination of the likelihood of facing physical peril at night. In terms of animal attacks, when one explores the data, the consensus is far from convincing. Between 1988 and 2009, 60% of lion attacks in Tanzania occurred between 6 and 10 p.m. A majority, indeed, but not anywhere near decisive enough to prove that fear of the dark is hardwired into our genetics due to such encounters. Further evidence can be found when one consults fatal attacks by wolves in North America. Whilst a rare occurrence, the few tragic cases which do exist tell us once again that attacks by predators are not inherently associated with the dark. At 6 p.m. on the 8th of March 2010, the body of a female jogger was discovered approximately 2 miles from the community of Chicknick Lake in Alaska. Terribly, the lady had been mauled to death by a wolf sometime earlier, well before sunset, at around 7:30 that evening. That is, of course, not to say that predators do not attack at night also. They most certainly do, and yet not to the one-sided degree which the evolutionary explanation for why we fear the dark assumes. Not merely that, since attacks by large predators often end unfavourably, the whole concept of an individual passing on a genetic memory to their offspring of bad things happening at night becomes problematic. Modern crime statistics are similarly inconclusive. The US Department of Justice's National Crime Victimization Survey keeps data on violent crime, including the time of occurrences as reported by the victim. Once again, there is no clear correlation. Between the daylight hours of 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., you are just as likely to experience violent crime as you are between the equivalent nighttime hours. And so, statistics considered, the evolutionary explanation all starts to look rather irrational. Rather than fear the dark for the lion attacks and violent crimes which may be committed against us in it, it would make much more sense for us to have simply inherited the fear of the lion attacks and the violent crimes themselves. And the irrationality continues when one realizes that the alleged adaptive behavior that enables one to manage a situation in a successful manner, is not so adaptive after all. Fear of the dark, far from being contained to unlit alleyways and other unfamiliar places, invades our homes. As previously mentioned, as many as 40% of adults find walking around their houses with the lights off scary. What is there to fear in the safety of our own homes? Thus, this so-called adaptive fear begins to look rather maladaptive, non-constructive, disruptive, and potentially even dangerous to daily life. After all, some people find the dark so unsettling that it negatively impacts their sleeping patterns. A small study of Toronto college students concluded that nearly half of participants who reported having poor sleep likewise reported a fear of the dark. Not merely that, the researchers involved in the study were able to confirm this objectively by measuring blink responses to sudden noise bursts in light and dark surroundings. Good sleepers became accustomed to the noise bursts, but the poor sleepers grew more anxious when the lights were off. Insomnia, the study suggested, was intrinsically linked to fear of the dark. And this is profound. Bad sleep equals bad health. It is a scientific reality that we need sleep in order to keep our bodies healthy and able to fight diseases. With a high and healthy level of melatonin, the hormone which is responsible for regulating the body's sleep-wake cycle, being associated with a reduced risk of cancer, good heart health, a strong immune system, and even pain relief. If fear of the dark was a useful behavior, an adaptive behavior which we have learned through evolution, then why is it so contrary to good health? At this point, evolutionary psychology faces a big problem. If there is a genetic basis to such a fear response, even if it is just a contributing factor, what are such genes doing remaining in our gene pool? One would expect that a maladaptive gene, one which triggers an unnecessary and stressful insomnia-inducing fear within our own homes, would have been weeded out by natural selection a long time ago, or greatly diminished at the very least. And yet this phobia is widely distributed in human populations all around the world. And so what is going on? If fear of the dark is not a useful evolutionary trait, then why do so many of us experience it? And here is where things get weird. What if fear of the dark is not so much a maladaptive, but misinterpreted behavior? Instead of being a misplaced fear of wolves and lions and nighttime miscreants, what if there is actually something in the darkness to justify a response? This is something which the British writer and lecturer of parapsychology and environmental psychology, Dr. Susan Blackmore, has called a sense of presence. Associated with sleep paralysis, this sense of presence was briefly discussed by Blackmore when she attempted to answer why we fear the dark in a piece for the BBC's science-focused magazine. According to Blackmore, our greatest fears come from our own minds, and so that sense of presence could conceivably be an imagined manifestation of all those ideas that we don't like to face, brought to the fore by the darkness when our brains, deprived of the visual input that usually keeps them busy, run free. And yet, it could be argued that explaining our fear of the dark has been a result of visual deprivation, provoking us to construct a false and terrifying reality shaped by our internal anxieties, does not go far enough to address the genuine sense of presence which Blackmore freely admits both children and adults feel when the lights go out. Rather than dismiss this out of hand, intimidated by the boundaries which it pushes, can we not instead explore this concept as something valid and potentially revolutionary in terms of explaining this common fear? It is an intriguing fact that the area of the brain associated with emotions and survival instincts becomes more active in the dark. Called the amygdala, this emotional processing center was recently investigated by researchers from Monash University when they exposed study participants to different light levels. By using functional magnetic resonance imaging, the researchers were able to observe in real time how moderate light levels suppress the activity of the amygdala more so than dim light. How we perceive and process the world around us is intrinsically linked through the amygdala to light and dark. Curiously, in paranormal belief, connection to the spiritual realm, to the likes of psychic mediums and empaths, is often associated with heightened emotionality. If this is correct, could it then be that darkness and the awakening of the amygdala which it provokes acts as a vehicle for paranormal perception? In other words, by turning off the lights, are we actually turning on the part of the brain which alerts us to a sense of presence? The unseen world, which is always around us, but we are not usually perceptive enough to experience. In the dark, eyes wide but seeing nothing, our emboldened fingertips stretch out, and we are just about able to feel the veil. Unable to explain it, not even expecting to experience it, we retreat to fear. The amygdala playing a part in paranormal experiences becomes all the more interesting when one examines children. Stereotypically scared of the dark and the monsters in closets and under beds, children are equally associated with paranormal experiences. They are also overwhelmingly influenced by the amygdala as their brains develop. A peer-reviewed scientific paper from 2017 suggests that there is a sensitive period for human amygdala development in the late infancy to childhood period, when the amygdala is particularly receptive to environmental stimulation. Studies have revealed that this receptivity, particularly to emotional stimuli, is larger in magnitude than the responses of older individuals, suggesting that, as we age, our amygdala's responsiveness to the world around us diminishes. Fascinatingly, the period when the amygdala is particularly receptive, late infancy to childhood, overlaps with the age range most commonly associated with early paranormal experiences. Indeed, the link between childhood and the paranormal is something which most, if not all, paranormal researchers will freely acknowledge. In terms of testimonial evidence, it is indisputable, as is another curious fact. Generally speaking, children grow out of their paranormal experiences. By a certain age, strange encounters seem to slip away, with the peculiar remarks and unsettling observations they present to their parents and guardians gone by the time adolescence approaches. One testimony which fits this pattern comes from a Quora user who responded to a question about childhood paranormal experiences. According to their post, their 6-year-old daughter frequently reported seeing older Siberian women in her closet at night. The child was, so the user explained, adopted, having come from an area in the polar cap, consistent with the women she was claiming to see at night. These experiences are said to have continued for 2 to 3 years, after which they suddenly stopped. And so, with the role of the amygdala in mind, could it be that children are more likely to be scared of the dark because they are better able to see or sense something which usually evades the attention of the adult population? Thus, in pursuing the reason for why many of us fear the dark, have we stumbled upon something profound. that exposure to the realm of the paranormal is somehow linked to heightened activity within the amygdala, which darkness provokes. Beyond the childhood connections, more links appear when one investigates those who claim to have spiritual awareness and meditation. Psychic mediums and empaths invariably cite meditation as a form of mental training, whereby they are able to increase or control their paranormal abilities. And several studies have shown that such practices do indeed affect the amygdala. A mental workout of sorts, meditation can induce neuroplastic changes within the amygdala, defined as the ability for neural networks within the brain to change through growth and reorganization. The result of this is that meditation is strongly associated with a general reduction in distressing reactivity. This could suggest that by down-regulating the amygdala through meditation practices, and thus suppressing fear responses and survival instincts, mediums are then able to harness their heightened emotionality unhindered and for practical use, namely connectivity to the spiritual realm. For the general population, who, with an untrained amygdala, lack the ability to control these dread survival instincts, the dark provokes only emotional chaos and fear. And thus the train of thought is this. The dark increases activity within the amygdala. The amygdala is associated with receptivity to emotional and environmental stimuli, which in turn is associated with mediumistic abilities and connection to the unseen world. The unsettled feeling that many of us experience in the dark is therefore not so much a fear of the dark, or indeed the presence within it. It is instead an exposure to something not quite within our reach, which our untrained amygdala, and no doubt the holistic functioning of the wider brain, generate a fear response to. And so, as we approach the end of this exploration, we return to our original question: why are we afraid of the dark? With hopefully new insight, and perhaps even a better question to ask: should we be afraid of the dark? After all, if this fear is truly triggered by a sense of presence, then that presence must always be there, the presence of the world which may, for the most part, be beyond our sight, but with the right training is most certainly not outside of our grasp. All we need do is turn off the lights and open our minds. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this more philosophical style of video, please do leave a like and a comment, and if you are not already, subscribe so that I know you are interested in more videos like this. And if you want an even deeper dive into the paranormal, I'm happy to announce that in response to the overwhelming reception that it has received, I've decided to give you all another week to watch In Search of the Dead, free here on YouTube. Thank you so very much to everyone who has already watched, most especially those who tuned in for the premiere group showing. It was truly wonderful to watch it with you all and read your comments. So if you haven't yet seen it, I really do recommend that you do. The link to it and the additional bonus Q&A session at the end being on screen now. Until next time,